Hello, this is Curtis, and you're watching the Playing with Art show. This is part 3 of the Unblocking Creativity series, and in this episode, we're going to play with form. Using cardboard from a cereal box and some tissue paper, we're going to make some simple three-dimensional shapes. This technique can be used to make all kinds of interesting shapes, but we're going to start with something really simple to unblock creativity and open up the flow. For this exercise, you'll need some colored tissue paper, a cereal box, a pair of scissors, white glue, a pen, water, and a brush with a flat tip and some wax paper. To start, cut the cereal box into individual panels from the sides of the box. The first shape we're going to make is a cube, so cut a long strip of cardboard and cut the strip the height that you want the final cube to be. Next, we'll fold it over 4 times to make the equal sides of the cube. We'll then trim off the extra at the end and then glue the 2 end sides together to create the square shape. Spread the glue very thin onto the cardboard. This is a critical step that it really has to be super thin glue in order for it to bond and dry quickly. Otherwise it'll take forever and you'll have to hold on to it all day. So you want a real thin layer of glue, which I usually use my finger, or you can use a small piece of paper to spread very thin, and then hold that in place for about 30 seconds until it has a nice firm bond. We'll then set that aside to let it dry, and after it's dry, we'll trim it to make the sides even. The next shape will be a cylinder, which is also called like a tube shape. And so we cut the cardboard to the height we want the cylinder, and using our fingers, we'll just soften and curve the cardboard. Sometimes it's good to do this a few times really gently to get a nice curve to the cardboard. If you are a little too forceful, the cardboard will crease. So start really soft and just gently kind of massage the cardboard into a curved form. We can then cut the strip down to the size we want our cylinder. If we want it to be really small, it'll just be shorter. If you want it to be a bigger, wide cylinder, you'd make a longer strip. Then we'll go back and we'll soften the cardboard just a little bit more. If it's a small cylinder, it's going to be a tight curve, so it's going to probably need a little more massaging to get a real tight curve on the cylinder. Then we'll glue the edge and wrap it around and glue it to the other side. Again, we'll let this dry and then we'll trim. If the sides don't match up evenly, we'll just trim that after it dries. Again, it's very important to have a very thin layer of glue, and then you're going to hold it probably about 30 seconds. I just move my fingers every so often and just make sure the whole surface is really pressed down and bonded really tight before setting it down. The next shape is going to be a cone. For this, we'll draw a circle on the cardboard, and again, we're drawing this. The cone will end up being a little bit smaller than the circle we draw, because as we draw it up into the point, it'll get smaller. So draw the circle a little bit bigger than you want the base of the cone to be. And then cut that out with the scissors, and then cut a line straight towards the middle from the edge of the circle towards the middle point. Put a thin layer of glue on the edges, and then again use your finger to spread it really thin. That's key to making this dry and bond quickly. If it's too thick, it'll take forever and it won't bond, it'll just slide off. So again, really thin coat of glue, using your finger to spread it really thin, and then pulling it together really slowly, letting the cardboard arch into a cone, and then you just pull it as tight as you want. The more you overlap the cardboard, the higher the point will be. The less you do, the lower level or smaller the cone will rise up. And then you need to hold that in place really tightly with your fingers, probably for about 10, 20, 30 seconds, depending on the humidity in your area. And again, you just want to hold that until it has a nice bond. Set that aside, and we'll move on to trimming the shapes and making the sides and bottoms of the shapes. And so I'll go back to the cube now, and where the edges of the cardboard weren't quite lined up, we'll just go back with the scissors and real gently just trim that off to make it even. We'll then lay that down on a piece of cardboard and trace around it to make the bottom and top of the box. And then we'll go back. We're going to make this oversized because we want to make sure it's going to fit completely over. And then we'll trim it down after it dries. So cut the first one and then go back using that one to trace around to make the second piece of the same size. Add a thin layer of glue to the sides of the box to glue. Again, this is really important to have a very, very thin layer of glue. So using your finger to spread it around really evenly and very thinly. And then place that over the cardboard top and press in, again holding it for about 20-30 seconds, making sure it's nice and firm and dry, and then go over and do that for the other end. We'll set that aside to dry, and then we'll go to the cylinder. Again, first trimming the sides to make them equal, and then using a piece of cardboard, trace the shape of the end to make the bottom and top, and then draw another line to make it oversized, and then cut those out and glue them on as we did before. And now we'll do the same for the cone. We'll trim the edge to make it even, hold it over a piece of cardboard, trace it, draw a line oversizing it, cutting it out, and putting a thin layer of glue on the edges and pressing it down. The cone is a little bit more difficult, so it probably takes a little bit more time of holding firmly, and knowing that we're going to be covering this with tissue paper, so if parts of it doesn't completely seat down, we can always cover that up with the tissue paper as the last step. Now before we trim the shapes down from the edges of the top and bottom, it's good to probably let them dry for an hour or so. So this is a good time to take a lunch break or a tea break. And then when you come back, it should be nice and dry, and we'll go in and just real gently trim the edges down to match up with the shape. Again, if this pulls away from the shape, we can always correct that with the tissue paper, but if it comes completely off, you'll have to go back and add some glue and glue it back on again. Now it's time to tear the tissue paper. This is to be torn in about 1-inch pieces. Do some that are strips of paper, some that are square, basically a few different sizes, so you have variety to get around the different parts of the shape. I usually recommend using 2 or 3 colors and then just using 1 color for each shape. Glue these down. We'll just put a small amount of white glue, and then we're just going to use our brush and dab into the water. We're just going to slightly water down the glue, not much, just a tiny bit. So what the water does is allows it to spread really evenly and thin. So we're just using just a little bit of water mixed with the glue. And then we're going to cover the surface of the shape initially, just do one part at a time. Again, if any of the bottom or tops are slowly coming off, we're going to use the tissue paper to pull those back together. Depending on how opaque your tissue paper is, it may take 2, 3, or 4 layers to get a nice solid color. The nice thing about tissue paper is it almost practically melts when you put the water and glue solution onto it, so it wraps around the shape really easily. So initially you just put down a layer of glue, put down the piece of tissue paper, and then go back with the water and glue solution and just gently brush it down. And again, this paper is so delicate that it'll just kind of melt and form naturally to the shape. Once you get the shape completely covered in one coat of the tissue paper, it's going to be somewhat sticky and sometimes hard to work with. So at some point, even if you're only halfway through, it may just get a little too sticky and unwieldy to work with. And that's a good point, just to set it down and let it dry and go on to the next shape, and then you can come back to it instead of struggling with it. Also, while it's sitting and drying, I use wax paper to help it be a little of a non-stick surface, but even still, it has a tendency to get stuck. So I recommend moving it around after a few minutes. Just gently move the box or shape so that it doesn't get totally glued to the wax paper. I recommend putting one coat on, setting it aside to dry, and then working on another shape before going back to adding the next layer. Again, it may take 3, 4, 5 layers of tissue paper to get a nice opaque color. Once you've done all the layers and they're completely dry, you essentially have a set of building blocks, and you can arrange these in a lot of different patterns and experiment and play and build more complex structures and more complex sculptures using these basic shapes.